I still remember the first time I realized I wasn't wanted. I was just 7 years old, standing in the corner of our cramped kitchen, holding up a solar system diorama I'd spent 3 days carefully building. My mom was fussing over my sister Betty's science project, practically glowing with pride. When I quietly asked for help, she didn't even look at me, just waved her hand and said, "Not now, can't you see I'm busy with Betty's project?" That moment, small as it seemed, left a scar that never really healed. It was my first taste of what it meant to be invisible in your own family. Growing up, Betty was the center of the universe. She was athletic, charming, outgoing, everything I wasn't. Our parents celebrated her every accomplishment like a national holiday. Meanwhile, I got straight A's, won academic competitions, joined clubs, but none of it seemed to matter. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became the background noise of my childhood. No matter what I did, I was always second place, always the afterthought. By the time I hit high school, I stopped trying to be seen. I learned to make myself small, quiet, compliant, invisible. When Betty made a mistake, I got blamed. When she succeeded, I was expected to cheer her on from the shadows. The injustice wasn't just in what they gave her, but in what they withheld from me: attention, pride, love. The breaking point came my senior year. I got accepted into Princeton with a partial scholarship. I remember the flicker of hope I felt as I handed my acceptance letter to my dad. Maybe this time, he'd be proud. Instead, he sighed, handed it back, and said, "We're already stretched thin with Betty's tuition. Maybe community college is a better fit." My heart cracked. In that moment, I knew my future was never going to matter to them. That night, I packed my things and walked away, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. Starting over wasn't easy. I deferred Princeton because I simply couldn't afford it, even with the scholarship. Instead, I moved into a studio apartment with cracked tiles, peeling paint, and a shower that only ran cold. I worked 3 jobs: tutoring online, waitressing on weekends, and stocking shelves late at night at a local bookstore. Most days, I barely slept. But in that exhaustion, I felt something strange. Peace. For the first time in my life, I was living for myself, not trying to earn love that would never come. No one from my family called. Not for my birthday. Not for Christmas. Not once. And while it hurt, that silence confirmed something I'd suspected for a long time. I'd never mattered to them unless they needed something. Slowly, that pain hardened into resolve. I became fiercely determined to succeed. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove to myself that I could. Tutoring became my lifeline. I was good at it, breaking down complex concepts, helping students believe in themselves. One student became 5, then 20, then 100. Word of mouth fueled my growth, but the road was far from smooth. Nights were long. I often cried in silence, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of carrying everything on my own. One illness, one late paycheck could ruin everything. Still, I kept going. When a developer ghosted me and my first website crashed, I sat on my apartment floor surrounded by unpaid bills and felt utterly alone. But instead of giving up, I picked myself up. I stayed up till 3 a.m. learning to code, teaching myself everything I needed to rebuild. Every failure was painful, but every mistake taught me something new. 2 years after walking away from my family, I had a waiting list for my tutoring services and was charging premium rates. I didn't have a degree yet. I didn't have a safety net, but I had something they never gave me: belief in myself. And that was the beginning of the life I'd always dreamed of, one built entirely on my own terms. By year 3, my tutoring business had grown faster than I ever imagined. I hired 2 other tutors to keep up with demand, but managing people came with its own challenges. I had no prior leadership experience, no mentors, no guidebook on how to run a business the healthy way. My first hire quit after just 3 months. Her exit interview hit me like a freight train. "You're too controlling, too much of a perfectionist. Honestly, you remind me of a parent who never believes anything is good enough." She didn't know it, but that comparison cut deep. Was I becoming the very thing I had escaped? I spiraled into weeks of self-doubt, replaying every moment of my childhood, wondering if I had internalized more of their behavior than I realized. I had worked so hard to break free, but here I was, repeating toxic patterns with the people I employed. The realization was humbling, but unlike my parents, I was willing to change. I hired a business coach, joined local entrepreneur meetups, and devoured every leadership book I could get my hands on. I studied emotional intelligence, communication strategies, and systems for healthy team management. Slowly, painfully, I began to reshape my leadership style, trading fear for trust, control for collaboration. By year 4, I had launched an online learning platform that attracted attention from the education technology space. Investors began to take notice. But with growth came pressure. Suddenly, I wasn't just managing students. I was being watched, evaluated, measured. The old insecurities came rushing back. I felt like a fraud, certain that once people saw who I really was, they'd walk away, just like my parents did. But the rejections never came. The more authentic I became, the more people respected me. They didn't need me to be perfect. They just needed me to be real. For the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was building not just a business, but a life that truly reflected my worth. By the 5th year, my business was thriving, but success came with its own brand of isolation. I had a sleek downtown office, a growing team, and my name was showing up in articles about innovative education startups. Outwardly, everything looked perfect, but inside, I felt lonelier than ever. I had built high walls to protect myself from the pain of being hurt again. Walls that had once served me, but now kept everyone at arm's length. I had colleagues, clients, even casual friends, but few people really knew me. I was terrified of vulnerability. What if I let someone in and they rejected me? What if they saw the scared, invisible girl I used to be? At night, I would look out from my apartment at the city skyline and wonder if this was what success was supposed to feel like. Quiet, cold, and lonely. The fear of being judged never really left. I kept waiting for someone to tell me I didn't belong, that I was a fraud, that I wasn't good enough. I prepared myself for the fall, convinced that it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. But despite the fear, I kept going. I went back to school part-time and earned my degree. I bought a beautiful apartment, one that actually felt like home. And most importantly, I began to let people in. Slowly, cautiously, I opened myself up to real friendships, people who saw past my success and into who I truly was. I began to understand something I hadn't before, that healing isn't just about breaking free from the past. It's about creating something new in its place. It's about building relationships rooted in mutual respect and allowing yourself to be seen fully, even if it's scary. The shadows of my past were still there, but they no longer controlled me. I was no longer the girl waiting for love that never came. I was the woman who had chosen herself, who had built a life not out of obligation, but out of purpose. And for the first time, I didn't just feel successful. I felt whole. 6 years of silence ended with a single name lighting up my phone screen. Mom. I hadn't heard from her or my sister Betty since the night I left home with a duffel bag and a heart full of betrayal. But suddenly there they were, missed calls, vague texts, messages full of urgency. We need to talk. Please call us back. It's important. I didn't respond at first, not out of spite, but because I needed time to breathe, to understand why, after all this time, they suddenly remembered I existed. When I finally answered Betty's call, her voice was shaky, her words hesitant. Their lives had crumbled. Our father had left for his secretary. The house was in foreclosure. Betty had dropped out of medical school. They had nowhere to go, and now they needed me. For years, I was the invisible daughter, the one whose dreams were dismissed to fund Betty's education, the one told to consider community college while my sister got Ivy League tuition. But now that they were struggling, I had value again. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as a lifeline. A storm of emotions swirled inside me. Anger, sadness, vindication. A small part of me, still wounded, ached for their approval. I imagined the fantasy, them moving in with me, apologizing, rebuilding what we never had. But that dream dissolved as quickly as it formed. People don't change overnight, especially not when desperation, not remorse, drives them. So I said no, not cruelly, not with malice, just firmly with the kind of clarity that only comes after years of healing. "I'm sorry you're struggling, but I can't help you. Not this time." I wasn't the child begging for love anymore. I was an adult who had fought for every inch of her success. And I knew now. I didn't owe my family a single thing. Not a house, not money, not a second chance they hadn't earned. Sometimes the most powerful word you can say to reclaim your life is no. That night, I barely slept. I paced my apartment, heart and mind caught in a tug of war between guilt and clarity. Yes, they were my family. Yes, they were struggling. But where were they when I was scraping together rent money in a studio with cold water and peeling paint? Where were they when I cried myself to sleep, wondering why I wasn't enough? The next morning, I received another call. It wasn't from Mom or Betty, but from my building's receptionist. My family was downstairs. I told her to send them up. When they entered my office, sleek, modern, polished, they looked out of place. Betty's shoulders were slumped. My mother's eyes were rimmed red. They stared at the success they never believed I could achieve. And for the first time, they truly saw me. Or so I thought. They began with pleasantries. "You look well," my mother offered. "We've missed you," Betty said. But the words felt rehearsed, hollow. Then came the ask. Money, a place to stay, help getting back on their feet. I let them speak, then asked one question. "When's my birthday?" They hesitated. Betty looked to Mom for help. "July 18th? Mom guessed. "It's April 3rd. I'd lived in that house for 18 years. They couldn't even remember the day I was born." That moment broke any illusion I had left. Their desperation wasn't about love or reconnection. It was about survival. I stood firm. "I believe you're sorry," I said, "but not for the right reasons." When they realized I wasn't going to save them, the mask cracked. Mom became defensive. Betty called me selfish. The same cycle all over again. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I didn't owe them anything. I had built a life from the ashes of their neglect, and I wasn't going to hand it over because they were finally facing consequences. I watched them leave with no guilt, no regret, just peace. Sometimes closure doesn't come with forgiveness. Sometimes it comes with a locked door and the strength to walk away, for good. As I stood by the window, watching their figures disappear into the city crowd, a strange sense of calm washed over me. For the first time in my life, I felt free, not just physically but emotionally. That little girl who once glued her school project alone at night, who spent years craving a shred of validation, had finally spoken her truth. And more importantly, she had been heard, even if not accepted. I returned to my desk, past the shelves lined with awards and framed media clippings about the success of my educational platform. This was mine, not gifted, not handed down, not inherited. Every sleepless night, every financial risk, every rejection, and every failed launch, it had all led me here. A life I built on my own, not in spite of my family, but because they never gave me the chance to be anything other than self-made. The calls and texts stopped after that final encounter. No more guilt trips, no more "we're family" appeals, just silence. And in that silence, I thrived. I threw myself into the next phase of my business, expanding into underserved communities, hiring tutors who reminded me of myself. Resilient, determined, overlooked. I mentored them not just in work, but in believing they were enough, that they didn't need anyone's permission to succeed. I started hosting workshops for students dealing with family trauma. It wasn't just about academics anymore, it was about healing. I wasn't just teaching, I was building a community. One rooted not in blood, but in shared values, integrity, growth, and earned belonging. One evening, after a long day of onboarding new hires, I walked into my apartment and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I didn't feel the need to explain myself or shrink myself to fit anyone's expectations. I was no longer invisible. That's when it hit me. Sometimes the family you're born into is the first challenge you must rise above. And in doing so, you don't lose yourself. You finally find who you were meant to be. 6 years of silence, and now they needed something from me. Not my forgiveness, not my presence, but my success, my money, my home. It was as if they had skipped over the years of absence, the birthdays missed, the tears shed in isolation, and thought they could reappear with a plea disguised as family loyalty. But I saw through it. The sudden flood of phone calls and messages wasn't love, it was desperation. That night, I didn't sleep much. I paced the floors of my apartment, heart torn between the instinct to protect myself and the ghost of a child who still wanted to be seen, to be loved. But I wasn't that child anymore. I was a grown woman who had faced the storms alone, who had created something meaningful from nothing, and I had every right to protect it. When Betty called again, her voice thick with emotion, I listened. Not out of hope, but out of closure. She told me about the foreclosure, about their failing lives, about how Dad had left. And for a fleeting second, I felt pity. But pity is not the same as trust. Pity is not reconciliation. I calmly told her no. No to a place to stay, no to financial support, no to reopening wounds just because it was convenient for them. Her voice shifted from pleading to blaming within seconds, and that only confirmed what I already knew. They weren't sorry for how they treated me. They were sorry they no longer had control. The next day, when they showed up at my office, I allowed one last conversation. I listened as they tried to rewrite the past, tried to make it sound less cruel, more understandable, but I wouldn't let them. I asked them simple questions, ones like, "When's my birthday?" and watched their silence reveal the truth. In the end, I wished them well, truly, but I stood my ground, because sometimes healing doesn't mean opening the door again. Sometimes healing means knowing when to walk away, and finally locking it behind you. As I stood in that sleek glass conference room, facing the two women who had once been my entire world, I felt something unexpected: peace. My mother and sister sat across from me, their practiced expressions of remorse failing to mask the entitlement behind their eyes. It wasn't real regret. It wasn't even sorrow. It was panic disguised as apology, and I didn't owe them anything. When I asked Betty a simple question, my birthday, she couldn't answer. Neither could my mother. 18 years under their roof, and they didn't even know the day I was born. That moment crystallized everything I had spent a lifetime trying to deny. I was never truly seen. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, only as a shadow behind Betty's spotlight. They said they missed me, but what they missed was what I could give. They missed the version of me that was quiet, obedient, useful. But that version no longer existed. The woman sitting before them now had built a life from scratch, a company, a home, a future, and she had done it without them. So when they pleaded again, asked for a place to stay, a loan, a second chance, I didn't hesitate. I told them no, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because true family doesn't vanish for 6 years and only reappear when the money runs out. True family doesn't measure love in utility. My refusal wasn't vengeance, it was freedom. For the first time, I chose myself over the fantasy of who I wished they were. I realized I didn't need their love to be whole. I didn't need their approval to feel worthy. As they walked out of my office for the last time, I didn't feel guilt. I felt grounded. The door behind them didn't just close, it locked. And not out of cruelty, but self-preservation. Some relationships can be healed, others must be released. And mine? It was time to finally let go of what never truly existed. I watched them walk away, my mother hunched with indignation, my sister storming out with bitter steps, and for the first time in my life, I didn't chase after them. There was no part of me left trying to explain, justify, or plead to be seen. I had spoken my truth. I had looked them in the eye and told them, calmly and without apology, that I didn't owe them anything. And the silence that followed? That was the sound of closure. They tried to guilt me, as they always had. After everything we did for you. But what had they really done? Fed me, clothed me, put a roof over my head? The bare minimum of parenting masquerading as a debt I was expected to repay for life. They never offered love, support, or presence. They didn't know who I was, what I cared about, or even the day I was born. And now, they only came crawling back when they had nowhere else to go. But I wasn't that invisible child anymore. I wasn't desperate for scraps of affection or desperate to earn my place in a family that never truly wanted me. I had grown. I had fought. I had built something real, something mine. I had learned that forgiveness isn't about allowing people back into your life. It's about letting go of the weight they once held over you. So I said goodbye, not with malice, but with finality. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally cared enough about myself to stop sacrificing for people who only saw me when it was convenient. Walking away wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the most loving thing I had ever done, for myself. I closed the door behind them, turned back to my desk, and took a deep breath. The chapter was over, the hurt was acknowledged, the lesson was learned, and the story ahead? That one would be written by me, on my terms, free at last from the family who never truly saw me. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked, taken for granted, or had to fight to reclaim your worth, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful Reddit family drama stories. Your support helps us bring more voices like this to life and reminds us all that we are not alone in our healing journey.